There's a long history of iconic photos in sports, and sometimes what's even better is the story behind them. November 1966, Muhammad Ali vs. Cleveland Williams at the Astrodome. Neil Leifer, one of the best sports photographers of all time, captured this historic shot of Ali laying Williams out on his back. Leifer was able to get the shot by hanging his camera over the ring, and thanks to the high lighting fixtures in the stadium, was able to use a normal lens to capture the entire ring. February 1988, NBA Slam Dunk Contest. Michael Jordan needed at least a 49 on his last attempt to beat Dominique Wilkins and take home his second consecutive Slam Dunk trophy. Photographer Walter Yost Jr. spoke with MJ before the competition and came up with a plan to get the perfect shot. As Yost put it, Jordan told him he'd put his index finger on his knee and point which way he was going before taking flight. The result? The quintessential snapshot of his airness that would go to adorn the walls of basketball fans everywhere. 2016, Summer Olympics in Rio de Janeiro. Usain Bolt, already the fastest man in the world, is captured by photographer Cameron Spencer, smiling mid-race. Spencer had to pan his camera with Bolt, all within the 10 seconds the race lasted, mind you, to get the perfect shot. Now, to kick off 2025, we've got another entry into this iconic sports photo album. The aerial shot of a B-2 Spirit stealth bomber during the flyover at this year's Rose Bowl. This photo has gone insanely viral over the last few days, with hundreds of millions of views on social media and broadcasters gushing about it on TV. There isn't an exact way to track these metrics, but I'd bet nearly 500 million people have seen this photo. A lot of the discussion around this photo is split into a few camps. One group just loves the photo, appreciating it on an artistic level. Another group focuses on the fact that military flyovers at sporting events are a waste of taxpayer money. And finally, there's people like me, the aviation enthusiasts who lose their mind whenever they see a $2 billion B-2 stealth bomber in action. We'll talk about the taxpayer Grinches in the second group later, but the most important part to me is the photo itself. I mean, just look at this beauty. I've talked to a lot of people about this picture over the last few days, and one of the first topics that gets brought up is drones. I've been asked questions like, what type of drone could capture such a clear image? How did the photographer receive clearance to fly a drone above a military aircraft and 100,000 fans at the Rose Bowl? Is this guy responsible for all those drones in New Jersey? Unfortunately for all the drone conspiracy theorists, there were no drones harmed in the making of this photo. In fact, there were no drones used at all. The photographer of this photo has been taking the same shot every year since 2009. It involves several weeks of planning, a private plane, discrete radio frequencies, some acrobatic moves in the air, and zero margin of error. Meet Mark Holtzman. If you couldn't already tell, Mark has always loved two things: photography and aviation. As a kid growing up in California, Mark and his dad spent thousands of hours taking and developing photos in their makeshift darkroom. At the ripe age of 17, Mark got his private pilot license through the Boy Scout Explorers program and started combining his two passions. Mark and his brother bought a small prop plane when they were in their 20s, traveling all over the West Coast and taking photos of whatever they thought was interesting. This small prop plane then became a slightly larger plane, a Cessna 206, which Mark still owns today. As Mark's life started to evolve, getting married and having two kids, he realized he needed a larger plane to fit his growing family. Mark told me, "My wife informed me one night at dinner that the airplane cost a lot of money to maintain. I needed to either have it earn its keep or needed to sell it. So one night, after a glass or two of wine, I decided to be an aerial photographer. Not much thought or research went into it, but I figured, what the heck? You know what they say, behind every great man is his wife saying, 'I told you so.'" At first, aerial photography was a part-time gig. Mark used his sales background to land jobs through cold calling. A real estate company wanted aerial photographs of a house, or a construction company asking for aerial updates on a project. Back in the year 2000, this wasn't such an easy task. Flying in his trusty Cessna 206, Mark would have to carry multiple rolls of film with him while flying, and it would take a day before he even knew if the pictures were any good. That's if Mark could even find the location. Remember, this is back in the ancient times of no GPS, which meant Mark had to use Thomas Guides, a physical paperback of spiral-bound maps. Mark persevered though, and eventually turned a part-time hobby into a full-time job. He brought on his son Steven to help, and officially started a company called West Coast Aerial Photography. They offered services ranging from aerial shots of a local university to 3D digital elevation models needed for aerial mapping projects. But we're not here to talk about aerial shots of a local development in Santa Cruz. We're here to talk about the Rose Bowl. Mark's relationship with the historic college football bowl started in 2009. As a trumpet player on the side, yes, this guy has a lot of passions, Mark was interested in seeing how the band formations looked at the Rose Bowl on game day. So Mark got flight clearance to take a Cessna 206 a few thousand feet above the Rose Bowl for pictures. He had also heard that the Air Force was sending a B-2 Spirit stealth bomber for the flyover and decided to stick around for a few extra minutes, capturing the perfect shot as fireworks went off. Once back on the ground, Mark and his son emailed the photo to an editor at Sports Illustrated with a message essentially saying, "We think our photo would look great on the cover." Ballsy? Yes. Worth it? Absolutely. Sports Illustrated didn't end up putting Mark's photo on the cover, but they did the next best thing, publishing it as a 2-page spread in the following week's print magazine edition. Since then, Mark and his son Steven have returned to the Rose Bowl nearly every year since. Other than the pandemic impacting attendance in 2021 and the occasional bout of bad weather, Mark returns every year to photograph the flyover on New Year's Day at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. So how does this process work? Well, it's lots of planning and a ton of paperwork. A few weeks before the event, Mark requests approval from various agencies that control the skies, including air traffic control and Pasadena Air Operations. Those agencies then set a pre-approved altitude limit, which was 4,500 feet this year, leaving about 2,500 feet of vertical separation between Mark and the B-2 Spirit. Mark takes to the skies in his Cessna 206 from Van Nuys Airport to the Rose Bowl, then hands the controls over to a co-pilot while he takes the photographs. Let me be clear though, it's not as simple as point and shoot. Mark does left orbits around the stadium, attempting to time his shot perfectly with the flyover. Not only that, he has to rotate the plane so the camera looks down on the field. And even if he times everything up perfectly, Mark has less than 2 seconds to get the shot, as the B-2 is flying at 250 knots or 287 miles per hour in the opposite direction of Mark's plane, which is going 100 knots or 115 miles per hour the other way. So yeah, it takes a little more than just hitting a button to get the photos Mark gets. And for all you amateur photographers out there, I know you're wondering about equipment. Mark used to take photos using a DSLR camera, but has since switched to a Sony mirrorless camera and Sony G Master lens 5 years ago and hasn't looked back. The other major important factor is communication. Originally, Mark only used to talk with air traffic control during the flight, but after a few of his photos went viral over the years, the B-2 pilots themselves started to reach out directly over email. Nowadays, Mark starts talking to the flyover pilots about a week before the game. He's still in constant communication with air traffic control from the second he takes off until he lands back on the ground. But Mark now knows how to go directly to the source, adding a separate discrete radio frequency to speak with the B-2 pilots during the flight. The entire process takes about an hour, including takeoff, landing, and more than 100 photos in between. These photos capture everything, from the crowds cheering to the mountain backdrop to the marching bands lining up, and of course, the main event, the B-2 flyover. Having your job take place thousands of feet in the air is sure to have some issues, but Mark has been mostly fortunate to avoid them over the years. The worst he's had to deal with was one year when the wind closed his window just moments before the B-2 crossed into the stadium. Always one to improvise though, Mark instinctively pushed the window open with one hand, holding the camera in his other hand, and managed to get a single shot of the B-2 flyover. Now, despite this being a fun behind-the-scenes story you won't hear about anywhere else, someone is inevitably going to email me saying flyovers are a waste of taxpayer money. And look, I'm not going to debate you on that. The Rose Bowl and its competing teams don't pay a dime for these flyovers, with the operational costs being funded exclusively by the government, aka taxpayer dollars. But I'd argue it's actually just a better use of taxpayer money than the alternative options. All aircrafts require a certain number of flight hours each year, and pilots use flyovers as time-on-target training. For example, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber used at this year's Rose Bowl came from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. If you look at the flight map that day, the pilots logged training hours in the time between the parade in the morning and the game in the afternoon. What I'm saying is, if these flights weren't happening above the Rose Bowl, they'd be happening somewhere else regardless. So why not make it somewhere with tons of people and plenty of cameras? Whether you agree or disagree, it doesn't really matter. What does matter is we get pictures like this from photographers like Mark Holtzman. And if that's not a great way to kick off the new year, I don't know what is. So the next time you see a B-2 flying over a stadium, don't think about the money it's costing you or me. Think about the guy flying 4,500 feet in the air who's desperately trying to get his shot just right.